The old asylum loomed like a skeletal husk against the bruised sky, its shattered windows and cracked stone facade speaking of long-abandoned secrets. Emmett stepped cautiously over the crumbling threshold, his flashlight casting fractured beams that struggled to cut through the gathering darkness. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something far more sinister, an undercurrent of decay that made his skin prickle. Beside him, Vivian's grip on her own light trembled. Her usually composed demeanor had already begun to crack, her eyes wide with the whispering echoes that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The asylum wasn't just abandoned, it was alive, pulsing with a darkness that waited. They had come in search of truth, though neither could articulate what kind. For Emmett, the lure of the asylum's cursed history was too tempting to resist. He'd always felt drawn to places others shunned, an inexplicable magnetism to the broken and haunted. Vivian, on the other hand, had reluctantly followed, her reasons shrouded in her own quiet suffering. But as they took cautious steps deeper into the asylum's gaping maw, the place felt less like an old ruin and more like a prison, one where the souls of the damned still clawed for release. A distant bang echoed through the hall, and Vivian flinched, her fingers brushing Emmett's arm. "Just old wood settling," he whispered, though the assurance felt thin. His words drifted into the darkness and were swallowed whole. The hallway ahead split into two jagged corridors, each one promising shadows more sinister than the last. Emmett's pulse thumped in his ears as he wondered which path held the greater terror, while unseen eyes seemed to watch and wait for them to decide. Behind them, the door they had entered through groaned closed, sealing them in with whatever horrors the asylum had been waiting to reveal. Just as Emmett opened his mouth to suggest a path, a cold draught swept past, carrying with it a whisper. It was faint but undeniable, a voice speaking from nowhere yet everywhere. It tugged at some part of his mind that he had tried to keep buried, something fragile and terrified. Vivian met his gaze, her lips parting with a question she couldn't form. The shadows seemed to stretch and coil around them, pressing in closer, as if eager to consume any courage they had left. Before either could speak again, the whisper returned, clearer and filled with an ancient grief. "Leave," it murmured, echoing from unseen corners. Emmett felt his knees weaken, but he straightened, driven by something he couldn't name. He stepped forward, choosing the left corridor, and the darkness swallowed him whole. Vivian hesitated for a heartbeat, her eyes catching a glint of movement in the periphery before she hurried to follow. Somewhere deep within the asylum, the forgotten ritual awaited, and its shadows had only just begun to stir. The hallway stretched into darkness, each creak of the floorboards echoing as if amplified by unseen forces. Emmett's heart thudded with every step, a relentless drumbeat against the suffocating silence. He tried to steady his breathing, but the air felt heavier the deeper they ventured. Vivian, just a pace behind him, kept glancing over her shoulder, her unease palpable. The walls here were marred with deep gouges, as though something had clawed at them in desperation. Every door they passed seemed to hold its own secrets, some ajar with shadows spilling into the hall, others sealed with rusted locks, as if to keep something or someone inside. They reached a room labelled psychiatric observation, and Emmett felt compelled to peer inside. The door creaked open to reveal a circle of chairs, each occupied by decaying mannequins dressed in tattered patient gowns. Their glassy eyes seemed to track his movement, and for a terrifying moment, Emmett imagined he saw one of them shift. Vivian inhaled sharply, her flashlight beam wavering as it caught something scrawled across the walls. "It hears us." The words looked fresh, glistening as though someone, or something, had carved them only moments ago. The room felt thick with a sense of waiting, an unspoken threat lingering in the stale air. A sudden crash reverberated from somewhere above, and both Emmett and Vivian froze. Their eyes met, wide with shared terror. "We shouldn't be here," Vivian whispered, her voice cracking. But before they could retreat, an icy wind swept through the hallway, extinguishing their flashlights. Darkness swallowed them, and Emmett felt a cold hand brush against his arm. He stumbled backward, fumbling for his light, but it was as if the shadows had a mind of their own, shifting and coiling around them like hungry tendrils. A faint rhythmic chanting began to echo from the stairwell, a dirge in a language neither of them understood. Gripping each other's hands, they stumbled blindly through the dark, their fear pushing them to move. They found refuge in another room, slamming the door behind them. As they caught their breath, Emmett's eyes adjusted to the gloom, and he realized they were in what used to be the Asylum's chapel. Crumbling pews faced a shattered altar, above which a stained glass window depicted a scene of angels and demons locked in eternal struggle. Vivian shivered, and her voice trembled as she pointed. Behind the altar, ancient symbols were etched into the stone floor, their meaning obscured, but undeniably malevolent. The sense of ritual and power emanated from them like a long-forgotten curse. The chanting grew louder, the words clearer, as if drawing closer with every beat of their terrified hearts. Emmett's gaze fell to an old leather-bound journal left on one of the pews. The cover bore the emblem of the asylum, but the pages inside detailed something far darker, an ancient ritual meant to seal away a great terror. His hands trembled as he read, realizing that the ritual had been left incomplete, and they had awakened something that should never have stirred. Emmett's hands shook as he clutched the ancient journal, the leather creaking beneath his grip. The chanting had grown deafening, resonating through the very stone of the asylum. It was as if the walls themselves were breathing, exhaling dread with every whispered word. Vivian stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the symbols carved into the chapel floor. The symbols now pulsed with a sickly light, illuminating her pale face in an unnatural glow. The ritual had begun to awaken, and with each pulse, the air seemed to grow thicker, saturated with a malevolent force. A sudden vibration rippled through the ground, and Emmett stumbled, the journal slipping from his grasp. The shadows in the chapel thickened, coalescing into forms that defied understanding, twisted figures with eyes that glowed a deep, malevolent red. Vivian's scream pierced the air as one of the shadow creatures lunged, its limbs unfurling like jagged branches. Emmett grabbed her arm, yanking her away just in time. They stumbled back into the aisle, their footsteps echoing as the darkness surged forward, hungry and relentless. "Emmett, we have to finish it," Vivian shouted, her voice breaking with desperation. She pointed to the journal lying just beyond the writhing shadows. The instructions for completing the ritual lay within, but reaching it meant facing the very horrors they had unleashed. Emmett's mind raced, torn between terror and the need to act. The chanting voices wove through his thoughts, pulling at the threads of his sanity. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, summoning whatever courage he could muster, and bolted toward the journal. His hands closed around the book and he spun back, only to see one of the shadow creatures looming over Vivian. Its mouth opened in a silent, gaping scream, and tendrils of darkness wrapped around her, pulling her to her knees. "Vivian!" Emmett roared, his voice cracking with fear. He opened the journal, his eyes scanning the ancient text, hoping against hope that he could decipher the final steps. The words swam before him, blurred by adrenaline and panic, but he forced himself to focus. With trembling hands, he began to chant the incantation, each word feeling like a knife dragged through his soul. The shadows recoiled, but their rage only intensified. The chapel shuddered, stone cracking and stained glass splintering in a cascade of coloured shards. Vivian gasped as the shadow's grip loosened, but it wasn't enough. The ritual needed more. An offering. The realization hit Emmett like a punch to the gut. Something had to be sacrificed, or the asylum's curse would never be broken. His eyes met Vivian's, and the horror of what he had to do sank in. The shadows writhed and recoiled as Emmett's voice wavered, desperately clinging to the ancient incantation. The room shook violently, and the symbols on the floor flared with a brilliance that seemed to burn through the darkness. Vivian gasped as the tendrils binding her began to unravel, the shadow creature hissing in fury as it was forced to retreat. But the room was falling apart. Cracks snaked up the walls, and the ceiling groaned as if the entire asylum were on the verge of collapsing. The ritual was working, but it came at a price, and the building itself seemed to be fighting back. Vivian stumbled to her feet, her legs unsteady, and grabbed Emmett's arm. "It's not enough," she whispered, her voice hoarse. The journal had hinted at a sacrifice, and as the pulsing light dimmed slightly, the truth became undeniable. Something more was needed to seal away the terror they had unleashed. Emmett's mind raced, torn between the urge to save them both and the realization of what was required. His gaze fell to the shattered altar, the crumbling stone inscribed with ancient runes that seemed to be waiting for an offering. A deep rumble reverberated through the ground, and one of the shadow creatures lunged again, its rage undiminished. Emmett stepped in front of Vivian, his heart pounding. "No," he whispered, clutching the journal tighter. He knew what had to be done, but fear and regret warred within him. The creature halted, its glowing eyes narrowing, almost as if it understood his hesitation. The asylum's curse had always demanded blood, a dark legacy of sacrifice that could not be escaped. Vivian's hand tightened around Emmett's, and tears glistened in her eyes. "We do this together," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Emmett's chest tightened, and he nodded, the weight of their shared fate pressing down on him. Together they moved to the altar, the journal clutched between them. The runes flared to life, and a chilling wind swept through the chapel, howling like 1,000 lost souls. The shadows encircled them, watching and waiting, as Emmett and Vivian prepared to give the final offering. Emmett whispered the last words of the ritual, his voice breaking with sorrow. The runes erupted in a blinding light, and the shadows screamed, their forms disintegrating into nothingness. The asylum shuddered, and for a moment everything was still. Then, as the light dimmed and the air grew calm, the chapel fell silent. The symbols on the floor faded, and the oppressive darkness lifted. Emmett and Vivian stood together, their hands still clasped, the weight of their actions hanging heavy in the air. They had banished the terror, but the asylum would never forget. The asylum had gone quiet, but the silence was no comfort. Emmett and Vivian stood amid the ruins of the chapel, the shattered stained glass casting ghostly patterns of light and shadow across the floor. The air felt strangely still, as though the entire building held its breath, waiting. The ancient runes had faded, leaving behind only the cold, etched stone and the weight of everything they had done. Emmett's legs felt like lead, and he sank onto a splintered pew, his breath ragged. Vivian sat beside him, her hands trembling as she wiped away the tears streaking her dusty face. "We stopped it," she whispered, though the words sounded hollow. Emmett nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the altar. The journal lay beside it, now little more than a collection of blood-stained memories. The shadows had been banished, and the ritual completed, but the asylum felt as though it was still watching them, a silent observer to their triumph and loss. He couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness had left something behind, something they would carry with them forever. The terror was gone, but the scars would remain. Outside, the storm had broken. Rain lashed against the shattered windows, a steady, cleansing downpour that seemed to mourn with them. Emmett rose slowly, offering his hand to Vivian. She took it, her grip firm despite the weariness in her eyes. Together they made their way back through the asylum, passing empty rooms and silent corridors that no longer whispered with unseen voices. But even as they approached the main doors, Emmett felt a tug of unease, a sense that the building wasn't done with them yet. They stepped into the rain, letting it soak their clothes and wash away the remnants of dust and dread. The asylum loomed behind them, a monument to the nightmares they had faced. Vivian turned to look at it one last time, her eyes narrowing. "Do you think it will ever really be over?" she asked, her voice small but resolute. Emmett didn't answer right away, his mind echoing with the memories of what they had endured. The shadows, the creatures, the ritual. It was all too real and yet somehow already fading into a dreamlike haze. As they walked away, the asylum stood silent. But deep within its crumbling walls, a faint whisper stirred, carrying the last echoes of the unfinished ritual. It had demanded blood, and though it had been appeased, the darkness was not fully quenched. The asylum would wait, biding its time until someone else came seeking answers. And when they did, the shadows would be ready, hungrier than ever for the souls brave enough or foolish enough to venture inside.